to what's been going on in China. We've seen a very, very, very stern crackdown by the Chinese forces on those incredibly brave protesters protesting for their right to free speech. We're holding up blank sheets of paper, complaining about censorship, but also against, of course, those strict zero COVID lockdowns they've been living under on and off for the last 2 years in many parts of the country. Well, those crackdowns appeared to have worked, as we saw very few protesters on the streets last night, certainly where there were British or foreign media able to view them. And this came on the evening that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, gave his very first foreign policy speech as Prime Minister. He gave this at the Lord Mayor's banquet in his white tie and tails at London's Guildhall. And he did criticise China's human rights abuses, but he said the UK cannot simply ignore China's significance in world affairs. Crucially, he said, the golden era of UK-China relations is over. Now, that phrase is very particular because that was a phrase used by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister on a trip to China in 2015. He talked about China being a challenge, but stopped short of using the word threat, a word he had used during the Tory leadership hustings over the summer. He said that closer economic ties of the previous decades had been naive, the idea that they would lead to a political rapprochement. And he said that we would have to replace wishful thinking with robust pragmatism, but he also warned against returning to Cold War rhetoric. Well, let's talk about the significance of this with Dr. Alan Mendoza. He's Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Good morning to you.
Good day.
Lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Just first of all, your general reaction to what he had to say. How significant is it that he said, for instance, that the golden era of UK-Chinese relations is over?
Well, I mean, I think it's significant because we all know the golden era was over a long time ago, basically. I think, we've had the debates for the last 2-3 years about what China's really up to. And the idea that any Prime Minister was going to return to that failed David Cameron, George Osborne paradigm was never going to happen. So, yes, it's significant because he said it, but it's not significant in the sense that we've known about this for some time. So it's nothing new, essentially, in that way.
There is that argument. I think we can see with the blatant open threats to Taiwan and the support for Russia during the Ukraine war. I mean, there's a giveaway, everybody. I'm not entirely sure, again, if you look at even at just what's been happening in the United Nations Security Council over the last few decades, why anyone thought China was on the side of the West. There was this view for years, and this had been the view when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is that if you allow any sort of free market capitalism to get into any authoritarian communist country, eventually that will lead to the fall of communism, the fall of authoritarianism, and the wonderful birth of democracy. Well, as that worked out in Russia, not so well as you would hope, for a brief period maybe, and certainly in China we have simply not seen this. Indeed, while they've seen this massive economic expansion and free market values in China, at the same time that has led to a massive political crackdown in terms of on dissent and free speech, hasn't it? So we've seen that go the exact opposite way in China.
I mean, I think the historic analogy you use is interesting because, of course, in the Soviet Union, you had glasnost before perestroika. So you had the opening of dissent, the ability to speak out against the regime before you did those economic changes.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
What the Chinese, of course, learned from this was don't give people the ability to talk out about us, because if you do, they'll sweep us away like they did to the communists in Moscow. So I think the Chinese model has been very different. You've seen it since Tiananmen Square. It's basically whenever there is even a hint of dissent, crush it ruthlessly. If anyone is asking for liberty, destroy them, basically. Put them in prison. Take away their rights and privileges. Monitor them. Make sure there is no ability to even organise in this way. And I think that's why it's so incredible you even had these protests in the last few days. In the first place, people knew full well they were risking their lives and essentially ending their existence as free people in China by doing so, and yet they still did it. So it's interesting that freedom urge is still there, but let's not be under any illusions. China is a ruthless authoritarian state, and it's only becoming more authoritarian rather than less.
I mean, and that's the thing, isn't it? When you look at someone just sort of standing there holding a blank piece of paper or just shouting, people just singing the national anthem, weren't there, as a way of like, well, we're not doing anything. Once you're dragged into that police van, you're likely to be beaten, tortured, imprisoned, disappeared, possibly even executed, but also your family punished as well. That is a very, long-standing way of dealing with things in these authoritarian countries that crushes dissent, the punishment that's meted out on the rest of your family. The bravery of these people is extraordinary. And I suppose the hope of these people, and you contrast that with people getting their knickers in a twist over wearing a rainbow bucket hat to a football match in Qatar and backing down over wearing a one love rainbow armband because you'll get a yellow card. Now, I don't think we should have ever planned to do that. I didn't want us to get the yellow cards, but you know, oh, that's the penalty. Oh, well, I'll give in. Oh, those are my principles. What's the price for them? These young, particularly young students in China, what they are willing to give up to try and have some freedom. I mean, again, not even the freedom of speech, but or just simply the freedom to leave their apartments once every 3 months during a zero COVID lockdown is extraordinary. And yet we continue to treat China on the world stage and in the West as if it's a normal country. Xi Jinping is greeted at international summits as if he's a normal person, as opposed to a horrific, monster, murderous tyrant. Why do we do that?
Well, this, unfortunately, is what you've seen in the Prime Minister's speech. Of course, he's called out some of the problems with China. He's made it quite clear, human rights abuses, problems in the area. But he's stopped short, of course, of saying it's a threat. In reality, as you highlighted, what China is doing domestically, internationally, cannot be anything but a threat to us from a value system, but also, crucially, from an interests area as well. What China is trying to do is set up its own dominance in the global system. And the reason we're all scared of calling it out is because China is already so well entrenched in that economic system that we feel that if we do it on our own, we will get slammed by China. There's only one solution to that, which is everyone stands together.
Well, indeed, and the Americans...
That's what you've said.
But Joe Biden has been much more forceful. I think he used the word threat, didn't he? And again, that's this Belt and Roads policy, while we've all just been sleepwalking and sort of, oh, well, let's go for net zero. China's been busy building their coal-fired, stations, power stations and taking over the world economy, buying up all of the rare metals and minerals that we need to do any of the green energy that people want, the lithium, the goodness knows what else. It is extraordinary what they've been doing and buying up the West. I mean, they've bought up large parts of London. They've bought up our culture and our university system. They basically own universities. Oh, we'll build you a new part of your university, new faculty, and they pour in millions or even billions in some cases to countries. And everyone's beholden to them. There is a real concern that British universities, people didn't speak out against, what had happened in Wuhan and the lab because they're so dependent on Chinese money. There was a plan. Huawei, let's have them involved in our 5G mast. Let's let them build nuclear parts for us. I mean, the idea that we would have let, for instance, Nazi Germany have that much say in our country in the 1930s, people would have thought was mad. But realistically, we're going to be at war with China at some point in the next 10 or 20 years. And yet here we are saying, come on in, the water's lovely. Oh, don't tell me he's frozen. Alan, can you hear me? We've got you.
Yeah, I think it's a... No, I'm not frozen. I'm here. Hello.
You've come back.
No, I think the reality is what you've got here is quite an extraordinary situation. You've got a threat from China. You've got this, as you say, this multi-year threat from China, a sense that medium term China is the biggest threat this country faces. And yet, what are we doing? We are pretending it's not that threat. It's still some kind of partner in some way, shape or form. This isn't an acceptable or sensible way for a country to behave. You're right to say that Joe Biden and the US has called it out. I think what's interesting in the US is that there is a cross-party consensus on this subject. And here, if you were to look at backbench MPs and the opposition, there is also a cross-party consensus. It just, for some reason, falls away at government level. Yeah. I think the government needs to do better on this subject.
Absolutely. Can I also get your thoughts on the online safety bill? Culture Secretary Michelle Donnellan, we're going to speak to one of her ministers later, has asked that requirement for legal but harmful content to be taken down by big tech platforms, but there will be multi-million-pound fines for content that children should not see. I mean, you've always spoken out against, censorship and the like, and of course freedom just being such an important part of democracy and free speech. What do you make of this change?
Well, I think it's a significant move by the government because anything that's legal is legal at the end of the day. OK, there are harmful things out there, but I think your previous guest mentioned it. People can, not look at those things, basically. They can choose not to go on there. If something is legal, then it should be allowed, basically. If people cross that boundary and break the law, then they should be pursued on social media or anywhere else as should be. I still think the best way to regulate social media, you'll stop a lot of this by requesting deeds on social media. You would have no problem verifying yourself. I'd have no problem verifying myself, but a troll would have every problem verifying themselves, and that would stop. a lot of this hateful conduct straight away.
No, I'm saying
don't take it off because
I get plenty of I get plenty of hateful content from people who are quite happy to identify themselves. I worry about people having to identify themselves in that way because that's what you have to do in China. Get massive controls there. Dr.